Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the student of Martin Luther King, the icon of the civil rights movement, the Honorable Dr. Julian Bach.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you a great deal for that wonderful, wonderful introduction. Thank you for this warm, warm welcome. It's a great, great pleasure for me to be here tonight. Don't you ever let somebody tell you that our young people aren't up to some real, real stuff. You couldn't help but sit in this auditorium and look at this parade of bright young minds go by to know that our young people are really, really up to some stuff. I can't put it in words. They're up to some stuff is all I can say. That was an expressive show of what we want our young people to be and what they are proving they are. It's a great pleasure to be here and great to hear about my association with Dr. King. I know that's why I was invited here, because you knew about my close, intimate, and personal relationship with Dr. King. I told people about this morning. You know, there are probably people in this room, and I know everybody in this room, or many people in this room, have met somebody who said, I was a student of Dr. King. But Dr. King only taught one class. Only 8 people in the class. I'm one of the 8. So I'm one of 8 people in the universe who can say I was a student of Dr. King's. When I was at Morehouse College, his alma mater, I took a course in philosophy that he co-taught with the man who had taught him philosophy. And I wish I could tell you I'd had the wit to bring a tape recorder to class, and I tape recorded these pearls of wisdom that fell from the lips of this marvelous man. I wish I could tell you that. But if I did, it'd be a lie. I didn't do it. I didn't even think of it. I wish I told you that I'd taken extensive notes, and I kept those notes until today. And I treasure those notes. I have them now. But I didn't do it. In fact, I'm not embarrassed to say I remember almost nothing that passed between teacher and student in the class. But I do remember one day, class was over, we were walking across the beautiful, beautiful Morehouse College campus, and I turned to him and I said, Doc, his friends called him Doc. I said, Doc, how you doing? He said, Julian, I'm not doing well. He said, unemployment is high, discrimination is everywhere, racial bigotry is running rampant around the world. He said, I feel awful. I have a nightmare. I said, no, Doc, turn that around, try I have a dream, and well, now, I sense a little doubt. Don't you know my word is my bond? You know, I just made that story up. And I shouldn't stop telling it now, because I was making a speech somewhere once, and the person read my biography, and then he said, and now the man who taught Dr. King to say I have a dream, and he called my name. And of course, I couldn't say, you fool, I never did that. But anyway, I ought to stop telling that story. But I want to talk about Dr. King. It was 1955, during the Montgomery bus boycott, that he was first introduced to the nation and the world. He was then only 26 years old. At that early stage, and at that early age of the stage of the Montgomery boycott, he understood how historic it would be. 4 days after Rosa Parks stood up for justice by sitting down, the boycott began. And that evening, at the first mass meeting, he declared, when the history books are written in the future, somebody will have to say, there lived a race of people, a black people, who had the moral courage to stand up for their rights. and thereby they injected a new meaning into the veins of history and civilization. In 1963 alone, the year that King, fresh from the battlefields of Birmingham, told the nation of his dream at the March on Washington, there were more than 10,000 anti-racist demonstrations. The result was the enactment of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the most sweeping civil rights law before or since, and one of Congress's finest hours. Now, we look back on those years between Montgomery in 1955 and the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 with some pride. Those were the days when politicians from both parties supported the struggle for civil rights. Now they struggle to be civil. Those were the days when banks loaned money to people, not like today when the people lend money to the banks. Those were the days we were powered by our values and not valued for our power. Those were the days when good music was popular and when popular music was good. Those were the days when the president picked the Supreme Court and not the other way around. Those were the days when we had a war on poverty and not a war on the poor. Those were the days when the voters chose their politicians, not like today, when self-serving gerrymandering and political manipulation allows politicians to choose their voters. Those were the days when the news media really was fair and balanced and not just mouthpieces for the misinformed. But those were not the good old days. In those days, the law, the courts, the schools, almost every institution favored whites. This was white supremacy. When the Supreme Court announced in May of 1955, in the second of two Brown decisions, that the white South could make hay slowly in dismantling segregated schools, I was 1 year older than Emmett Till. His murder 3 months after the second of the two Brown decisions was much more immediate to me than the court's ruling had been. We were nearly the same age when he was killed in Money, Mississippi, for whistling at a white woman. His death terrified me, but in the fall of 1957, a group of young black teenagers encouraged me to put that fear aside. These young people, the 9 young women and men who integrated Little Rock Central High School, set a high standard of grace and courage under fire as they dared the mobs that surrounded their school. Here I thought, this is what I can be if ever the chance comes my way. The chance to test and to prove myself did come my way in 1960, as it came to thousands of other black high school and college students across the South, in a mobilization of young black people not duplicated in our country before or since. First through the sit-ins, then in the freedom rides, then in voter registration and political organizing drives in the rural South, we joined an old movement against white supremacy that had strong, deep roots. Now, Dr. King was the most famous, the best known of all the modern movement's personalities, but we should remember this was a people's movement. It produced leaders of its own. It relied not on the noted, but on the nameless, not on the famous, but on the faceless. It didn't wait for commands from afar to begin a campaign against injustice. It saw wrong and acted against it. It saw evil and it brought it down. Now, many of us now stand in reflection of that earlier movement's successes, including the election of Barack Obama, confused about what the next steps ought to be. The task ahead is an enormous one, equal to, if not greater than, the job already done. When we look back at that movement from today, we now see a very different view of the events and periods of that period. Instead of the towering figures of Kings and Kennedy standing alone, we now see an army of anonymous women and men. Instead of famous orations made to multitudes, we now also see the planning and the work that preceded the triumphant speech. And instead of a series of well-publicized marches and protests, we now also see long organizing campaigns and brave and lonely soldiers often working in near solitude. Instead of prayerful petitions for government's deliverance, we now see aggressive demands for the ethic of self-reliance and self-help. We now realize our view of the movement's gains was narrow too. Seeking more than the removal of racial segregation, that movement didn't want to be integrated into a burning house. Rather, we wanted to build a better house for everyone. We marched on Washington for freedom and jobs, not for abstract freedom alone. And instead of a sudden and unanticipated upsurge in black activism in Montgomery in 1955, we now see a long and unceasing history of aggressive challenges to white supremacy that began as long ago as slavery time. And instead of a movement that ended in 1968 with the death of Dr. King, we now see continued movement stretching from the ancient past until this moment, with different forms and personalities, in many places and locales, with differing methods and techniques, whose central goal has always been the elimination of restrictions based on race. The founding of the NAACP in 1909 gave that movement an organized base. It soon developed an aggressive strategy of litigation aimed at striking down racial restrictions enshrined in law, triumphing in 1954 with Brown versus the Board of Education, ending legal segregation in public schools. That decision effectively ended segregation's legality. It also gave a nonviolent army the license to challenge segregation's morality as well. From Brown in 1954 forward, the movement expanded its targets, its tactics, and techniques. Organizations and leadership expanded as well. When King came on the scene as the leader of the Montgomery bus boycott, he began to articulate a new method, nonviolent resistance, of fighting segregation. This new method required direct action through mass participation. Reliance on slower appeals to the courts began to subside. In that period, gains were won at lunch counters, at movie theaters, at bus stations, at polling places, and the fabric of legal segregation began to come undone. That movement then was a second Reconstruction, whose ripples were felt far beyond the southern states and whose victories benefited far more than blacks. Like the first Reconstruction, it saw gains for blacks extended to greater protections for others. Like the first, it gave new life for other movements of disadvantaged Americans. And like the first Reconstruction, the second one ended when the national purpose began to waver and reaction swept the land. But before it slowed, it changed our country forever. A voteless people voted with their bodies and their feet and paved the way for other social protests. The anti-war movement of the 1960s drew its earliest soldiers from the Southern Freedom Army. The reborn movement for women's rights took many of its cues and much of its momentum from the Southern movement for civil rights. This year, we celebrate the 50th anniversary of one of the greatest legislative accomplishments, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The year before, in June of 1963, President John F. Kennedy spoke to the nation about his plans for a comprehensive civil rights bill, declaring, "This nation, for all its hopes and all its boasts, will not be fully free until all its citizens are free." Dr. King called the speech one of the most eloquent, profound, and unequivocal pleas for justice and the freedom of all men made by any president. President Kennedy, of course, would not live to see his bill through Congress. That job would fall to Lyndon Johnson, his successor. Johnson was more than up to the task. When told by his advisors that he should not lay the prestige of the presidency on the line over civil rights, Johnson asked, "What's it for if it's not to be laid on the line?" His strategy was simple, no compromise. It would be a fight to total victory or total defeat without appeasement or attrition. He wrote, "This bill passed the House in February 1964, but the Senate fought harder and took longer. The Senate liberals, with Minnesota Senator Hubert Humphrey as its floor manager, were, in President Johnson's word, organized as never before and perhaps as never since. Southern senators, led by Senator Richard Russell of Georgia, promised to fight these proposals to the last ditch. The result was the longest filibuster in Senate history, 75 days. To end the filibuster, a two-thirds vote was required on a legislative device called cloture. On June 10, 1964, Senator Edward Dirksen, Republican of Illinois and Senate Minority Leader, took the floor to say, "The time has come for equality and opportunity in shaping in government, in education, in employment. It will not be stayed or denied. It is here. America grows. America changes. And on the civil rights issue, we must rise to the occasion." That calls for cloture and to the enactment of the Civil Rights Bill. The Senate, for the first time in history over a civil rights bill, voted cloture by a margin of 71 to 29. The fight was over. Dr. King would be among those present when Johnson signed the bill into law on July 2nd, 1964. Discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, henceforth would be prohibited in places of public accommodation and in any program receiving federal funds. Discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin, or sex was prohibited in employment. But literally, as the civil rights community savored their triumph, they dealt with tragedy. On June 21st, 1964, 3 civil rights workers had gone missing in Mississippi. As authorities searched Mississippi's rivers for the bodies of Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, Michael Schwerner, 8 other bodies were found of disappeared black men, including 1 headless torso and 1 body cut in half. The remains of the civil rights workers were found on August 4th, 1964. Andy Goodman was 20 years old, James Schwerner was 24, and Chaney was 21. If the movement's origins were as a bitter struggle for elemental civil rights, it largely became, in the post-segregation era, a movement for political and economic power. And today, black women and men hold office and wield power in numbers we only dreamed of before. But despite impressive increases in the number of black people holding public office, despite our ability to sit and eat and ride and vote and go to school in places that used to bar black faces in some important ways, non-white Americans face problems more difficult to attack now than in all the years that went before. We are such a young nation that so recently removed from slavery that only my father's generation stands between Julian bond and human bondage. Like many others, including some in this room, I am the grandson of a slave. My grandfather, James Bond, was born in 1863 in Kentucky. Freedom didn't come for him until the 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865. He and his mother were property, like a horse or a chair. As a young girl, she'd been given away as a wedding present to a new bride. And when that bride became pregnant, her husband, that's my great-grandmother's owner and master, exercised his right to take his wife's slave as his mistress. That union produced 2 children, one of them my grandfather. At age 15, barely able to read or write, he hitched his tuition, a steer, to a rope and walked 100 miles across Kentucky to Berea College, and the college took him in. My grandfather belonged to a transcendent generation of black Americans, a generation born in slavery, freed by the Civil War, determined to make their way as free women and men. Dr. King belonged to another transcendent generation of black Americans, a generation born in segregation, freed from racism restraints by their own efforts, determined to make their way as free women and men. When my grandfather graduated from Berea in 1892, the college asked him to deliver the commencement address. He said then, "The pessimist from his corner looks out on the world of wickedness and sin, and blinded by all that is good or evil or hopeful in the condition and progress of the human race, bewails the present state of affairs and predicts woeful things for the future. In every cloud he beholds a destructive storm, in every flash of lightning an omen of evil, and in every shadow that falls across his path a lurking foe. He forgets that the clouds also brings life and hope, that lightning purifies the atmosphere, that shadow and darkness prepare for sunshine and growth, and that hardships and adversity nerve the race as the individual for greater efforts and grander victories. While we struggle toward greater efforts and grander victories, we're still being tested by hardships and adversity. The rich have been sitting at the banquet table, and the rest of us have been on the menu. So the gap has grown between the haves, the have-mores, and the have-nots. The top 10% of earners got more than half the country's income in 2012, the highest level ever recorded in a century of data collection. The top 1% alone got more than 1/5 of the total income. Plutarch warned, an imbalance between rich and poor is the oldest and most fatal ailment of all republics. More recently, another great man gave this counsel: when the earnings of a minority are growing exponentially, so too is the gap separating the majority from the prosperity enjoyed by those happy few. This imbalance is the result of ideologies which defend the absolute autonomy of the marketplace and financial speculation. In this system, which tends to devour everything which stands in the way of our increased profits, whatever is fragile, like the environment, is defenseless before the interest of a deified market, which becomes the only rule. That was Pope Francis speaking late last year. People of color, of course, are more likely to be poor than rich, and they are worse off than their white counterparts. They are too fragile in the face of a deified market. The median wealth of white households is 20 times greater than that of black households and 18 times greater than that of Hispanic households, the largest ratio since these data were first collected a quarter of a century ago. While white households saw their median wealth fall by 16% between 2005 and 2009, it fell by 66% among Hispanic households and 53% among black households. Almost every social indicator, from birth to death, reflects black-white disparities. Infant mortality rates are 134% higher for blacks. Chances of imprisonment are 570% higher. Rates of death from homicide are 493% higher. Lack of health insurance, 33% more likely. Proportion with a college degree, 53% lower. And the average white American will live almost 4 years longer than the average black American. The Civil War that freed my grandfather was fought over whether blacks and whites shared a common humanity. Less than 10 years after it ended, the nation chose sides with the losers and agreed to continue black repression for almost 100 years. The freed slaves found their former masters once again controlled their fate. American slavery was a human horror of staggering dimensions, a true crime against humanity. The prophets had produced endowed great fortunes and enriched generations, and his dreadful legacy embraces us all today. 246 years of slavery, followed by 100 years of state-sanctioned discrimination, reinforced by public and private terror, ended only after a protracted struggle in 1965, 2 years after Barack Obama was born. If you are 50 years old and older, and I saw when I came in that some of you are, it's only in your lifetime that racial equality before the law became a reality and not before. For roughly 50 years, only have all black Americans been granted the full rights of citizens. Only 50 years since legal segregation was ended nationwide. Only 50 years since the right to register and vote was universally guaranteed. Only 50 years since the protections of the law and Constitution were officially extended to everyone. We are now asked to believe that 200 years of being somebody else's property, followed by 100 years of legal oppression in the South and discrimination in the North, we're being asked to believe that that can all be wiped away by 5 decades of half-hearted remediation and 1 black president. We're asked to believe now that despite more than 3 centuries of horror, no permanent damage was done to the oppressors or the oppressed. We're asked to believe that we Americans are now a healed and whole people. As one historian has observed, the greatest impediment to achieving racial equality is the narcotic belief that we already have. The truth is that Jim Crow may be dead, but racism is alive and well. That's the central fact of life for every non-white American, including the President of the United States, and I was not surprised to see him say that today. It eclipses income, position, education, race trumps them all. In his second inaugural address, Abraham Lincoln reflected on the war and its causes, slavery. The historian Eric Foner writes, in essence, Lincoln asked the nation to confront unblinkingly the legacy of slavery. What were the requirements of justice in the face of this reality? What would be necessary to enable former slaves and their descendants to enjoy fully the pursuit of happiness? Lincoln did not live to provide an answer. A century and a half later, we have yet to do so. So we have work to do. None of it is easy, but we've never wished our way to freedom. Instead, we've always worked our way. Today, we have much more to work with, and we take heart that so much has changed. The changes that have come have everything to do with the work of the modern movement for civil rights. There needs to be a constantly growing and always reviving activist progressive movement across America if we're going to maintain and expand victories and our vision for the country. We can't forget that Dr. King stood before and with thousands, the people who made the mighty movement what it was. From Jamestown slave pens to Montgomery's boycotted buses, these ordinary women and men labored in obscurity. And from Montgomery forward, they provided the foot soldiers of the Freedom Army. They shared with King an abiding faith in America. They walked in dignity rather than ride in shame. They faced bombs in Birmingham and mobs in Mississippi. They sat down at lunch counters so others could stand up. They marched and they organized. King didn't march from Selma to Montgomery by himself. He didn't speak to an empty field at the March on Washington. There were thousands marching with him and before him, and thousands more who did the dirty work that preceded the triumphant march. The successful strategies of the modern movement for civil rights were litigation, organization, mobilization, and coalition, all aimed at creating a national constituency for civil rights. Sometimes it is the smallest of deeds, sitting at a lunch counter, going to a new school, applying for a marriage license, casting a vote. These can challenge the way we think and the way we act. Racial justice, economic equality, world peace, those are the themes that occupied Dr. King's life. They ought to occupy ours today. We have a long and honorable tradition of social justice in this country. It still sends forth a message that when we act together, we can overcome. One thing we can act together on now is the restoration of the principal parts of the Voting Rights Act. As you know, the Supreme Court eviscerated the act last June. Until then, it had been renewed routinely by bipartisan majorities in the Congress, most recently by lopsided majorities in the Republican-dominated House and Senate in 2006. You need to ensure that your member of Congress becomes a sponsor and supporter of this bill, this important legislation that ought to be supported for everyone. My slave-born grandfather speaks to us today. Wrong, he said, may for a time seem to prevail, and the good already accomplished seem to be overthrown. But forward in the struggle, inspired by the achievements of the past, sustained by a faith that knows no faltering, forward in the struggle. Thank you.
Aurora, let the applause go louder for Dr. Julian Bond, one of just 8 students of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. We are so honored with your presence here in the City of Lights. Oh, you're not tired. Let him hear your love. He travels all over the country, and I know there's no city like Aurora, and the love that we have for Dr. Bob. Thank you. I'm going to ask our mayor to please come down. Presentation for you.
Put you to work today.
Well, I'm almost speechless, not quite. But I want to say that it's been really a true honor to me, and I think to our entire community, to have Dr. Julian Bond with us tonight, to share his memories, but more importantly, to share his wisdom. And as we leave tonight, we must remember that yes, we've made progress, but the struggle goes on. Thank you, Dr.
On behalf of the mayor's office in the city of Aurora, we have a presentation of Dr. Bob and Dr. King. We'd like you both to step in the center, please. Let's give another round of applause to Dr. Bob, to the mayor, to all of you. We're not done yet, we're almost done. What a historic day here. What a historic time, I believe, again, on this 85th anniversary of the birth of Martin King. But he would be proud of the work that we're doing here in Aurora as a whole, and definitely proud of one of his just 8 students, Dr. Julian Bond. One more round of applause. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Did you enjoy his speech? Oh, historical, contemporary, inspirational, educational, classic Julian Bond.